What's up, guys? In the shop today to pick up on our choices series here to talk suspension choices. So I'm going to cover three main styles of suspension. There's a lot of different types of suspensions out there, but with talking about diesel drag racing here, diesel trucks, there's three main types. You've got 4-link, you've got ladder bar, also known as 3-link, and leaf springs. So I'm actually going to start with the 4-link, which is the most complicated, but it will help you better understand the ladder bar and the leaf spring. So we're going to jump right into 4-links. Okay, we're going to use this whiteboard drawing that I did here to illustrate the 4-link. There's a lot of information on the internet about 4-links, and some of it can get really confusing really quick. So I'm keeping this like an entry-level video, so you guys don't get overwhelmed, because there is a lot of stuff that can overwhelm you with a 4-link. But for today's purposes, we're just going to talk about what exactly it is. So this would illustrate the brackets that are on the rear end housing, and this would illustrate the front brackets that are on the chassis. These tubes would be the chassis at the top. So a 4-link is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You have 4 links, 2 on each side. You have a bottom link bar and a top link bar, and these tie the rear end to the chassis. There's adjustment holes on both sides of the top and the bottom of the rear end housing, and the top and the bottom of the chassis side. The purpose of these holes and these adjustments are so you can move the 4-link bars in any one of these positions. We're not going to get into exactly what these changes do per se. I want to save that for a more technical video, but the simplest way to talk about this is leverage. So if you were to draw an imaginary line on each of these 4-link bars, wherever the intersect point would be is the point in which it is trying to pick up on the car. So you can change these intersect points by moving. You could take the bottom bar and move it all the way in the top hole, and that would make it a really steep angle. And you could leave this one like this. That would make you have a really short instant center. So that would change where it's picking up on the car. It'd be picking up, or the truck, it'd be picking up way closer to the back of the vehicle. You can change the spread on the housing here to determine how quickly the chassis reacts. But you're going to be able to plot out and make just about infinite amount of changes with a 4-link setup because of all of the holes and the variations in which you can configure this thing. So moving on to the shocks. The shocks are going to have, this is where you're going to be able to change the ride height up and down, is on the back of the 4-link housing here. There will be a bunch of holes where you can take this shock bracket and you can move it up or down, and then that's actually going to push the chassis up or down, and that's going to change your actual ride height. You can also manipulate ride height with springs, spring rate, and how much shock shaft you have showing, but in a later video I'll explain why you don't really want to do that. And then on a 4-link, because there are 4 links, there's a heim joint here, a heim joint here, one here, one here. You can get a lot of articulation where the axle will want to roll back and forth like that. So you have to run an anti-roll bar. An anti-roll bar has a link of its own that bolts to the rear end housing, and then the arm of the anti-roll bar bolts to your chassis. This keeps the chassis nice and square when you apply power. It doesn't allow it to twist left or right. If you've ever seen an old car that picks the left front wheel way up, but the right front's on the ground and the chassis is all tweaked over, that would be the same thing that would happen in this if you did not have an anti-roll bar. The biggest benefit of a 4-link and being able to have all of these adjustments is where it's going to put your instant center. Instant center is the imaginary intersect line where each of these 4-link bars would intersect, and being able to move that up, down, out, and shorter in the truck is the major benefit. There is an imaginary line called an anti-squat line. I'm not going to get into a ton of it, but I want to talk about it because it matters on all of these types of chassis. Anti-squat line starts at the bottom of your tire, which, say in this illustration, would be down here at the bottom, and it goes to the top of the front tire. So it's just a imaginary line that runs all the way across. And the closer you get this intersect to the anti-squat line, above it or below it will make the chassis either squat. If it's below the anti-squat line, it will squat. If it's above the anti-squat line, it will separate. Having the 4-link adjustment like this means that you can put it anywhere you want it on that line, and that's pretty important for lining out a combo that, say, has a really bad weight bias like a 4-wheel drive diesel truck does. Drawback, I suppose you could say, of a 4-link is that you can really get lost with changing these points. You can really make a truck do exactly what you want with this setup, but you can also get really way out in left field really quick. This is a setup that is ultimately going to be the best setup, but you're going to have to put in the work and the time. You might use every one of these holes in this bracket before you figure out exactly the setup that works best for your particular truck. Like I've said in previous videos, there's no magic 4-link setup. You can't ask somebody else what their setup is and plug it right in and say, oh yeah, put it on the 3rd hole up at the bottom bar and the 2nd hole up at the top bar and make the spread as wide as possible at the housing, and it'll work. Because just because that works for their truck does not mean that it's going to work with your wheelbase and weight bias and the way that your truck makes power and your gear ratios. So if you're going to do a 4-link, you're definitely setting yourself up for success in the long run, but you're going to have to be willing to put in some work to make these things right. Okay, now we're moving into ladder bar. As you can see, pretty similar to 4-link, except for now a few things have changed. We no longer have double adjustable holes as far as top and bottom goes on the chassis side, and we've lost a lot of adjustment holes on the rear end side. This is because this is a ladder bar, or also known as a 3-link. It's commonly in the race car world called ladder bar, but I've heard a lot of guys call it a 3-link. And that's because there are 3 heim joints. There's 3 links. One in the front at the chassis, one at the lower part of the rear end, and one at the upper part of the rear end. So instead of the 4-link, where the upper bar had all these ranges of adjustments that you could do, the upper bar on this is now welded to the bottom bar. So what this does is it essentially makes your instant center a determined length that you cannot change, because back to the imaginary lines, draw one through this way, one through this way, where they intersect is the intersect point. Well, that is right here on this particular setup. So this cuts out a lot of the getting lost per se, with all of the range of adjustability that you have a 4-link, but it also locks you into an instant center that is a predetermined length. Whatever you make this bottom bar, which is typically around 30 inches on a ladder bar setup, that's what you're stuck with. And then you have a little bit of adjustability on the housing side, but not much. Usually you can move them, the whole ladder bar setup up or down 1 hole, and that's about it. In the front is where you have most of your adjustability. You can run this thing way up and way down. A ladder bar, because of its naturally short instant center, is always going to want to separate. There's no way around it, just because of the short instant center. So the higher you move this up in the chassis, we're back to that anti-squat, you're getting further and further up on the anti-squat line. You're really making it try to separate a lot. With it in the top hole, with the really short instant center, it's not using much of the car. It's just snapping the rear end down. So if it's snapping the rear end down, you have a lot of force at the initial hit, but you don't have as much force carried out down track. So you could set the tire really, really hard, too hard, spin the tire, and then you need to make an adjustment here. You move the ladder bar down to help fix that. The farther down in the chassis you go with the ladder bar, the more it's trying to use the entire car as leverage, as opposed to just using the back of the car to shove it up and snap the tire down. So you don't get as lost with this particular setup, but you really back yourself in a corner on the maximum adjustability. There's a lot of places where ladder bars are totally fine, and there's a lot of places where you really need to have a 4-link. The other thing about a ladder bar is typically the housing brackets don't have adjustable brackets for the shocks, so usually that's a separate welded on bracket. The benefit of a 3-link is you no longer have to run an anti-roll bar. You can if you want to, but because there's only 1 link on the chassis side on each side, they won't have that tendency to actually roll the chassis over. Something you'll notice that the 3-link or ladder bar has that the 4-link does not have is there's now been an adjuster actually added into this top link bar, and that's because with these being welded, you would not be able to change the pinion angle or the way that this rear end housing rotates without a second adjuster in line. And so you will actually use that to set preload and pinion angle, which we will talk about when we get into the more technical suspension videos. All right, so last but not least, leaf springs. So everybody, I think, is pretty dang familiar with what leaf springs are, regardless if you have a car or truck. But brief summary, you have a spring that has 1 bolt on the chassis side in the front, 1 bolt on the chassis side in the back. It's a flat tempered piece of steel, and that is the main spring that holds your vehicle up. So leaf springs are definitely the most simple setup because there's not much you can do with them. You can change, like a stock truck would have like 6 of these leaves. I've illustrated 3 here because most guys will do a 3-leaf pack. Like on Newman's truck, we have a mono leaf, which means 1 singular leaf. And the mono leaves are designed to still hold the weight but be 1 spring. You can get into changing a lot of the way that the chassis acts and reacts with the weight, basically these spring rates. Imagine this is just a coil spring that's all laid out. They still have different spring rates and weights that you can go by. So there is a bit of adjustment there. It's obviously going to be all manual adjustment, swinging different leaf packs in and out. And then, so if you did not have any sort of Caltrac assassin bar at the bottom, that would be it. That would be all of the adjustment that you would have, and you would just basically be able to run a set of good shocks, and it would be is what it is. The problem with a leaf spring that doesn't have some sort of traction bar, as it's very commonly defined by, is they want to axle wrap. So this axle wants to twist like this. And what a leaf spring will allow it to do is it'll kind of twist and move upwards when it does. And so that's why you see a lot of, bouncing and stuff like that with cars that are axle wrapping or trucks that are axle wrapping. So you put some sort of link bar on the bottom, tying it to the front of the spring perch and the bottom of the rear end housing, and that eliminates axle wrap. What this also allows you to do is back to that anti-squat line and instant center like we were talking. Leaf springs do actually have an instant center. Even though they're not as easily defined, technically the top imaginary line starts where the leaf spring pack bolts to the top of the rear end on a truck and goes to where it bolts to the chassis side. So if you drew an imaginary line from here to here, that is your top imaginary line that's going to end up being your intersect point and where it lands on the anti-squat. You really can't change this much other than with ride height. You can move the ride height up and down minutely and change that minutely, but for the most part you're stuck with whatever that is. And the bottom, you're stuck with whatever it is on this side, on the rear end side, but you have typically, like on a Caltrac, you have 3 holes in the top here. So the purpose of these holes are at the front here are you can change your instant center. You can make it shorter or longer based on these, and change when you shorten it or lengthen it. You're also changing if it lands higher above the anti-squat or lower below the anti-squat. Pretty much it's about impossible to get it below the anti-squat. So you're going to be very similar to a ladder bar in the way that you treat this, because it's always going to want to extend and smash the tire into the ground. So if you want it to extend more, smash the tire harder, move it all the way up. If you want it to slow the chassis down and don't hit the tires hard, you move it all the way down. And then the shocks pretty much stay the same along the path of all four link, ladder bar, or leaf spring here, all three. And on a ladder bar or a leaf spring, it's just like a ladder bar where you have to weld on additional shock mounts. This is definitely the simplest setup. This is going to take the least amount of work. You're going to be able to go out with this and for the most part have good success quickly, but this is definitely the most limiting. You do not have nearly the range of adjustment even compared to a ladder bar. So this is a really good entry level, and I don't say entry level in the terms of which I offend anybody, because there's guys that have been 6s in the quarter on leaf springs. Leaf springs are cool and you can do a lot with them, but this is definitely what I would consider your entry level chassis. It's what your trucks came with factory. This is where a lot of guys are going to start right here. So you're going to treat this a lot like you would the ladder bar and vice versa. So I tried to keep all that as simple as possible. I hope it was. It's kind of a lot to take in. That's why we're doing all this chassis stuff in very small baby steps. In my opinion, taking away from all that information we just talked about, I would not choose a ladder bar. If you're going to build a chassis, I would not build a ladder bar, because you are stuck with that fixed instant center, and that's going to be problematic. It's going to be really hard to make that work really good. Not saying that you can't, but you're going to have to work a lot harder and eventually end up not as well. You're never going to be able to make that do what a 4-link can do. Especially if you're doing a 4-wheel drive truck, I would not go ladder bar. Now, if you bought something already that is ladder bar, don't go cut it up. Go to the track with it and make adjustments and work on it, and you could probably make it go pretty fast. But if you're going to build something, I personally would not build a ladder bar. You can go really fast on leaf springs. There have been guys, I think the leaf spring record in the 8th, I think somebody's gone at 399. So you can go stupid fast on leaf springs. Leaf springs are good because the trucks came with them from the factory, so it's going to be your cheapest option on your build. It's going to kind of depend, if you're going to do a full tube chassis build, obviously you're not going to put leaf springs in it unless you're trying to run a specific leaf spring class. But if you just bought a truck that you're working on and you're progressing in, maybe it's run 670s now and you want to step into 590, I would have no fear personally keeping it leaf spring and building off of that. I really like to just build off of a combo and just keep optimizing it. And eventually you might find a point where, hey, this is all this thing will do. We need to 4-link this thing. But I don't think that you necessarily have to jump into the 4-link ring. Now, talking about 4-link, if that's the direction you want to go and you want to start off with that, do a bunch of research, because like I stated, you can get really lost with a 4-link. It's ultimately going to be the best thing for you. It's also going to be the most expensive route and the most time consuming, because you're going to have to run an anti-roll bar. It's going to take you a while to build everything and set it all up properly. So the 4-link is a commitment. But with that commitment comes an opportunity for a lot of success. So I hope that was a good overview on the 3 major types of suspensions, and I look forward to getting into more of the nuts and bolts of how everything reacts and acts on a later video. Thanks guys, catch you on the next one.